Chapter 14 of Julia Ried. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 14, in which I am stung with the truth. As my hand rested on the knob of the door, I still had in mind the image of Mr. Sayles as he lay floundering about on the ice, but it vanished the moment my eyes glanced on the pale, troubled, cultured face that turned quickly to meet me. "Oh, Miss Ried," he said eagerly, "God bless you for this. You have done for me, I cannot tell you what." He came toward me quickly and grasped my hand, as he continued speaking in an eager, excited tone. "I have suffered, no mortal knows how much, since yesterday evening, when I watched in vain for a line from you. The pain grew insupportable today, and I felt compelled to throw myself on Mrs. Tyndall's mercy. Yet, do you know, I only half trusted your goodness after all? When I told Mrs. Tyndall to tell you, from me, that, unless you came to me willing to forgive and forget, I could not endure to meet you at all, and to refuse to see me if you could not do this, I was sorry the moment the door closed after her, and in the intervening time I have undergone tortures lest you should decline to see me at all." He need not have feared. I had received no such message. I tried to tell him so, but he was in such eager haste to talk, to explain, to palliate, that there seemed no chance for me. Well, I need not go over in detail the conversation that we had during the next half hour. Indeed, it is not clear to me. It took me at a disadvantage from the first, since my very coming was the sign of peace between us. I remember I felt annoyed and bewildered at first, but as he talked, mingling graceful touches of thanks among his earnest words, I gradually grew to feeling as if some way, by somebody, he had been cruelly abused during the past few days. All my indignation seemed to melt away. I half forgot at what I was supposed to be indignant. The gentleman before me bore no resemblance to my companion during that horrible walk, and it almost seemed to me as if that evening must have been spent in some far-away dreamland, as if the whole scene must have been just a horrid nightmare. I don't know how it happened. I have tried to think, and I can't. But I do know that when I met Dr. Douglas just at the foot of the brilliantly lighted stairs that led up to the hall, my hand rested on Mr. Sayles' arm, and his head was bent toward me while he continued to talk in low, eager tones. The hall was a perfect babel of tongues. A dozen voices seized upon Mrs. Tyndall. She was the acknowledged leader among the young people. She was one of those fair-faced, youthful-looking, elegant women, with enough of matronly dignity about her to insure her a hearing and a genuine fondness for all the gaieties and frivolities of girlhood. She had few domestic tastes, plenty of leisure, plenty of money, exquisite skill and tact, so that she was equal to any occasion. So it followed that the girls leaned on her, quoted her, followed her lead on all occasions, and allowed themselves to be ordered about in her graceful, good-humored way. As for the gentlemen, the most of them, with the exception of Mr. Sayles, were quite young, and I doubt if there was one among them who had not made the elegant little lady his confidante. So the crowd surrounded her the moment we entered the hall, and all talked at once. "Mrs. Tyndall, Lycia Simons says that religion ought to dress in black. Did you ever hear of such a thing? Mrs. Tyndall, Cora Kenyon can't find a costume for the 4th scene in this town. What in the world are we to do? Mrs. Tyndall, have you arranged for Queen Vashti's dress? Mrs. Tyndall, are you going to help me this evening? I can't get the curtain the right shape." "Softly, softly, girls," chimed in Mrs. Tyndall's gentle voice. "You deafen me. One thing at a time, please, and we'll have it all arranged in order." Meantime Mr. Sayles kept up a running, low-toned commentary. "Religion dress in black, what does the girl mean? It's appropriate, though, for half the religionists in the world. They are walking tombstones. Do you imagine that that wonderful woman is going to bring order out of all this confusion? She's a remarkable woman, but if this thing doesn't culminate in a grand failure I shall have an immense increase of respect for her powers. However, we'll help her to the best of our abilities." Later in the evening I sat busily sewing, just behind Lycia Simons and Florence Hervey. I was wedged in among bundles and baskets of finery and rolls of curtains. There were a few stitches to be taken on an important ruff for a lady of olden time, and I had dropped down here to attend to it. The two girls were similarly employed over articles wanted at once, and as they worked they gave me the benefit of their conversation. I could not decide then whether they spoke louder than they were aware of, or whether they wished to give me their views on the subjects discussed. I don't know now which it was, and it doesn't matter. I heard them anyway. Lycia spoke in the decided tone of voice that was natural to her. "I'll tell you what I think of it. I think Mrs. Tyndall hasn't shown her usual good taste in her selection of a character for religion. My face isn't the right sort at all. I know so little about the genuine article that I can't even simulate it. But I know who could, and that's Frank Hooper." "Frank Hooper!" And Florence's tone expressed well-bred horror. "Yes, Frank Hooper. You've heard of her, haven't you? It isn't 2 years since she was the star at your birthday party, and she still lives, even though she doesn't get invited to our parties. And a capital person she would be to take this part." Florence's voice was dignity iced as she answered: "I should think you were decidedly descending in the social scale. I fancy we can find ladies enough in our own circle." "Social fiddlestick!" Lycia said, waxing warm. "Don't talk any more nonsense, Flo, than you can help, because I really haven't much patience left for that sort of thing. However, it's more funny than anything to use such phrases in connection with Frank Hooper. It's a sort of revenge, isn't it, because Frank queened it over you so long?" Florence's answer had about as much argument in it as that queenly lady was capable of using. "I don't associate with shop girls." And Lycia, in her response, did not lower her voice a note. "Don't you? I thought you called on Julia Ried." "So I did, but she is not a shop girl. She is Messrs. Sales and Getman's bookkeeper." "Oh, it's the material one works with that makes the lady, is it? I didn't know before. One daubs in ink and the other in paste, and the inky one is a lady and the pasty one not. That distinction is worthy of Mrs. Tyndall herself. My dear, you're a promising pupil. Now, I should prefer the paste myself, because a little clean water will wash it off, and ink sticks." Florence laughed a good-humored, graceful laugh, as one too assured of her position to make it worth her while to grow indignant over any language that might sound like ridicule, and answered composedly: "Don't be absurd, Lycia. Of course I know that Julia Ried doesn't belong to our set, but then Mrs. Tyndall chooses to pet her, and she's a bright sort of creature. And now, while we have so much to do about this festival, she is quite a help. So I called one afternoon when I knew she was out. It took very little of my time, and probably did her a world of good. I can't imagine, though, why Mrs. Tyndall makes so much of her. Can you? It seems to me that today, after the lapse of years, I can feel how hotly my cheeks burned over all this. But I fairly held my breath for Lycia's answer, for I had occasionally pondered over the same question myself. Lycia evidently knew without pondering, for she answered quickly: "Mrs. Tyndall would make much of a cat who would mew and purr when she told it to, and never at any other time. This one looks as though there were enough in her to make her scratch and spit occasionally, but Mrs. Tyndall knows how to stroke her fur and keep her quiet, I suspect." And then these two girls laughed, while I, sitting quietly behind them, felt as though I should like to choke them both. Lycia continued the subject: "So far as I'm concerned, I rather like the girl. I've no sort of objection to calling on her, nor on Frank Hooper either. I hate all this silly twaddle about social position. It's a real shoddy style, to make wealth a mark of distinction, and that is certainly all that Frank Hooper has lost." "Why did she want to go into that shop, do you suppose? Everybody was ready to befriend her. You know Mrs. Tyndall offered her a home." Whereupon Lycia laughed outright. "I wonder if you are deluded enough to believe all that," she said gaily. "You evidently have Mrs. Tyndall's version of it. The plain English is, that she offered to give her the position of seamstress in her family, a position which Frank was much too sensible to accept, for more than one reason, principally, though, because she knew that Mrs. Tyndall would interfere between Jerome Sayles and herself. She has succeeded in that, however, and that, by the way, is part of Julia Ried's mission. If he were not a complete ninny, he would stand by Frank Hooper through it all. I detest that fellow. The only sensible thing about him is his admiration for Frank. Now I'm prepared to startle you in another way. I know who would make a lovely Quakeress, and I mean to get her into it. That's little Ruth Walker. That small gray mouse who disturbed you and Mrs. Tyndall so much in class, until you succeeded in sending her over among the black sheep in Dr. Douglas's class. She's a shop girl, you know, so I'm out of my set again, down in the depths this time, for little Ruth never was rich in her life, I think, and I absolutely fear that her mother does fine ironing for a living. She used to sew, which was more respectable, of course, until a horrible pain in her side obliged her to disgrace herself still further by taking to ironing." Miss Florence shrugged her aristocratic shoulders and said simply, "Suit yourself, so that I don't have to be bored with the little white-faced morsel. I really am indifferent as to whether she plays Quakeress for you or not." At that moment Mrs. Tyndall came from the staging, where she had been ordering the gentlemen as to the arrangement of curtains, lights, etc., and joined the group of sewers. Both young ladies addressed her at once with, "Mrs. Tyndall, Lycia has some new and startling plans to offer, and Mrs. Tyndall, I have 2 new performers for you, excellent ones." That lady sank gracefully down among the crimson curtains lying in heaps on the floor, and answered brightly, "Enlighten me then, speedily, for I must return to the platform in a very few minutes. It is going to take us all the evening to get ready to work. Men are so stupid. What is the plan, Lycia?" "I propose Frank Hooper to take the character of Religion, if we want to make that a success. She is the one that can do it." "I don't feel at all doubtful about its success with Lycia Simons as the principal figure. Besides, Frank has been invited to join us, and has declined, as she does all other civilities. She has chosen her own course. I don't see that we can do anything but quietly let her alone. I know how you feel, dear girls, and I honor your motives, but I think Frank has so entirely separated herself from us by her late conduct that we must leave her to reap what she has sown." Lycia answered with the utmost composure, "I have no special motive for you to honor, Mrs. Tyndall. My object in asking Frank to take the character is that I feel she will do it justice. As for her late conduct, I think it was a sensible thing to do, and I have liked her better ever since." Mrs. Tyndall laughed and leaned caressingly on Lycia's arm, as she said, "We all know what proportion of your remarks to consider genuine. What is the other project? Consider this one dismissed, will you please? I cannot possibly spare you from that tableau." "The other is that I mean to have that little Ruthie Walker for the Quaker scene." There was a determined glitter in Lycia's eyes. She had evidently yielded the other point, more I thought because she knew that Frank would have been obstinate, but the tone in which she said, "I mean to have," was very decided. I looked to see Mrs. Tyndall as decidedly oppose it, and then I fully expected a disruption, but by this calculation I showed that I did not know Mrs. Tyndall. She instantly and gracefully acquiesced. "I don't know but it would be a good idea. She has a demure sort of face, and that character is not yet supplied. She would certainly have one immensely convenient qualification, she would do as she was told." With which parting shot she turned toward me. "Julia, my dear, is that rough proving too much for you? You are looking very much flushed." I expected to see 2 young ladies flush guiltily at this reminder of my close proximity, but they did not even glance in my direction. Then they must have desired me to hear them; either that, or they had no idea of the loudness of their tones. I have sometimes thought that Lycia, at least, had a friendly desire to warn me of my nearness to danger, and although she did it in a stinging way, had my good at heart, but I do not know how that may be. I only know that it stung deeply. The rest of the evening was a pain and a bewilderment to me. There were moments in which I fully resolved to have nothing more to do with them, to refuse to take any part in this festival which had suddenly become so disagreeable to me, to leave Mrs. Tyndall, to go away from them all, home to my mother. Oh, mother, mother! I remember just how longingly my sick heart cried out after you that night, just as it had cried in vain many, many times since. I don't know whether Mrs. Tyndall was gifted with a sort of clairvoyant power or not, or at least, I mean it used sometimes to seem to me as though she must have been. She came up with me to my room that night. She dropped herself daintily among some red cushions, and passed her hand softly over my flushed and heated forehead in a winning way she had, while she talked to me in those cooing tones of hers. Poor child! She is very tired and a little bit disgusted with everybody. Don't you find girls very insipid, Julia? Lycia Simons is, between you and me, the only really brilliant one we have, though it would never do to tell Florence Hervey that. But Lycia is rude and sharp in her language. The child doesn't like me. I thwart her pet schemes too often. I laugh sometimes to think of what stinging things she probably says about me when I am out of hearing. She has one fancy of which I must try to disabuse her. She seems to think that I have dropped Frank Hooper because she has chosen to enter a shop, which, of course, she had the right to do if she pleased, and equally, of course, that can never put her on a level with ignorant, uncultured shop girls. My reasons for declining to continue my friendship for her were based upon her exceedingly improper conduct toward Jerome Sayles. The story is much too long to weary you with tonight, but some time I must tell you about it, and you will have more sympathy for poor Jerome when you think of the annoyance to which he has been exposed. Now, my poor tired child, do get to rest as quickly as possible. Do you know that your tableau is going to be perfectly lovely? I tossed and stumbled very restlessly instead of sleeping, but I finally concluded that Mrs. Tyndall had been slandered, that whatever her faults she really loved me, that tender, clinging kiss as she said good night was my last pleasant proof, and I dropped asleep very firm in the resolve to show Florence Hervey that in spite of not belonging to her set, I belonged to Mrs. Tyndall's and Mr. Sayles's, and that I assisted in making a tableau that was perfectly lovely. End of Chapter 14. Recording by Trisha G.